We are wrestling.
We all like having a go at Vince Russo, and why not? Arguably the easiest single person to pin the blame on for the death of WCW. It's not difficult to list a bunch of terrible decisions made by Russo, and that would certainly have been an easier video for me to make. Oh, let's see, off the top of my head, we could have gone with making himself world champion, making David Arquette world champion, Judy Bagwell on a forklift or turning Goldberg heel, Oklahoma, of course, Bash at the Beach 2000, whatever the weird grudge he had against Dustin Rhodes was, or the entire David Flair and Stacy Keibler nonsense, the list goes on. Even Arn Anderson, who, let's remember, has one of the greatest minds in the business, is to this day convinced that WWE sent Russo to WCW as a Trojan horse in order to destroy them. Having said all of that, if you take away these terrible booking ideas and look a little deeper, you can see some decisions that make perfect sense. And if only Russo had had a filter just like the one he'd had in WWE, aka Vince McMahon, it's possible to envision some of his ideas actually making a difference in turning WCW around. By focusing only on the positives, I've managed to sift through the mud to find 5 diamond decisions that Vinnie Roo made as WCW booker back in the year 2000. Russo has stated that he believed Bret Hart to be a wrestling superhero, and that his time in WCW should have been a return to babyface form for Bret, even going as far as saying the whole main event scene should have been built around him going into the year 2000. If we rewind to just weeks after the Montreal Screwjob in late 1997, Bret debuted as a guest referee in a match against Eric Bischoff and Larry Zbyszko. Despite Hart signing to a $2.5 million a year contract and giving him a light working schedule, it quickly became evident that Bischoff didn't see Hart as an immediate main eventer, as he booked him in matches against Booker T for the TV title, and he crowned him US champion. Later, Hart would become engulfed in the continuing mess that was the NWO storyline, and he continued to hover around the United States Championship. You'd be hard pushed to name him as one of the highest paid members of the roster if you didn't know otherwise. It was a situation that Bret Hart was well aware of, and the animosity between him and Bischoff exists to this day. In May 1999, Bret was to receive the worst news of his life when he learned of his brother's death at a WWE pay-per-view. He would take 4 months off work subsequently, and by the time he returned, Vince Russo was nearly on the scene as booker in WCW. He was a Canadian hero. I respected Bret more than anybody. The name, the tradition, it was just the way he carried himself. One of Russo's immediate decisions was to push Bret back to the top of the card, crowning him world champion. This was absolutely a smart decision. The tried and tested tradition of having one company figurehead was a strong way to book any promotion, and Bret had proved that he could shoulder that responsibility back in WWE. Plus, coming off the Montreal Screwjob, there was still a charged atmosphere of sympathy towards him and the way he'd been treated. I tried my hardest to put Bret back in the spotlight and back in the spot he deserved to be in, because when he was under Bischoff's thumb, he was just another wrestler. I mean, they did nothing for him, and I was really trying to make him special again. Russo was succeeding in his plan as he paired Hart up with Goldberg, but unfortunately it would be short-lived as Goldberg injured Hart in December 1999, putting him out of action permanently. One thing that is crystal clear when analysing Russo's WCW booking decisions is that he knew that everyone on the roster should have a character and every active performer should have a storyline. Yes, many of his characters and storylines missed their mark by a wide shot. However, with Lance Storm, he proved that he could get new wrestlers over with the remaining fan base. Lance Storm was no spring chicken, of course. One half of the Impact players in ECW, he was regarded as an incredibly adept technical wrestler, but somewhat charismaless. Lance Storm reached his career zenith in WCW under Vince Russo's booking. You see, Russo took Mr. Roboto and gave his character life, in spite of himself. First, Russo played up to Lance's strengths by presenting him as a technical wrestling machine as he won the US title, the Cruiserweight title and the Hardcore title in quick succession. He held all of the belts at once. Nobody else in WCW had ever held 3 titles at once. In a masterstroke of heel booking, Storm renamed the titles the Canadian Championship, the 100 kilos and under title, and the Sasquatchian Hardcore International title, and covered the belts in Canadian flag stickers. Storm was already getting over as a heel, and an upper mid-card heel at that. Quickly, Storm took another step up the ladder as he was joined with fellow Canadians in his Team Canada faction, in which he was the leader, and he went on to challenge Booker T for the World Heavyweight Championship as a believable contender. I honestly believe that if WCW had continued in some form with Russo as the booker, Lance Storm would have been a legitimate main event superstar in a rejuvenated WCW. Factions are cool. You got the Four Horsemen, DX, the Shield, Evolution, I could go on. And yes, I realise I've missed out the NWO. I'll admit that I was, and in some ways still am, a huge NWO mark, at least for its first couple of years in existence, but it's safe to say by early 2000 we were all in agreement that it had run its course. NWO 2000, aka NWO Silver, did nothing to reinvigorate the product. It seemed as though Bischoff couldn't stop going back to the NWO well, what with it being his masterstroke in the first place, so at least Russo had the forethought to realise that factions are good, just not necessarily more NWO. If he was to just introduce another faction and it was just the NWO in any other name, then there was going to be no point. Enter the New Blood versus Millionaires Club feud. While it was uneven in many places, it is a great example of Russo trying to push something new that actually made sense. This was really the only good idea that came out of the Russo-Bischoff partnership of mid-2000, as both appeared as on-screen characters for the story. On an April episode of Monday Nitro, the duo announced that they were starting from scratch. This time, aging veterans like Hogan would not sabotage their ideas, and all of the belts were going to be vacated. The New Blood was a stable that formed around Bischoff and Russo in support of their vision. New wrestlers such as Mark Jindrak and Sean O'Haire joined veterans like Rey Mysterio, Booker T, Jeff Jarrett and Billy Kidman. Those wrestlers were technically veterans, however they were the kinds of wrestlers who had been held down in the years before. I went into WCW with the philosophy of we have to start getting these younger mid-card guys at the time over. We've got to start moving these guys into the spotlight. They still had Hogan and Flair up top. These were guys underneath that weren't getting the opportunity to play the main stage because of the politics. The Millionaires Club was made up of the likes of Sting, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, DDP, Sid Vicious, basically all of the top names you can think of that ruled WCW in the mid to late 90s. The glaring issue in this booking was the New Blood were presented as heels in the story, while the veterans were the babyfaces. It always felt as though the booking would have worked better as a shades of grey, good guys and bad guys story rather than having a clear divide. Nonetheless, Russo's idea was a totally different brand of gang warfare to that had been previously presented in the NWO, and it certainly helped get those wrestlers who had been previously held back some screen time. WCW was always criticised for holding younger talent down and pushing the proven veterans, but with this storyline they could have their cake and eat it by getting both the old guys and the new guys involved at the same time. Russo's smart booking here eventually came to a head when it collided with his own off-the-rails style, and unfortunately the feud would be marred by constant worked shoots and confusing decisions, and in the end it failed to get the younger talent properly over due to the Millionaires Club coming up trumps most of the time. It would be a failure in the end, but the good intent was clear to be seen on Russo's behalf here. WCW were the absolute pits at giving every roster member something to do back in the mid to late 90s. Even if a wrestler was in the NWO, quite often they'd be left standing in the background nodding along to a Hogan or Kevin Nash promo in the middle of the ring. Vince Russo has been credited as giving low and mid-card acts in WWE a purpose during his booking there, and that can be seen in WCW too. There were far too many wrestlers languishing around the Cruiserweight division, for example, putting on spectacular matches week after week, but not going anywhere up the card even after holding the Cruiserweight title. It was a curse afflicted upon the likes of Chris Jericho and Eddie Guerrero earlier in the 90s. When it came to the likes of Shannon Moore, Shane Helms and Evan Courageous, they would have been destined to be the cruiserweights of the new millennium if Bischoff had still been in command. Russo, however, managed to package these three talents as characters in their own right. As a heel stable, the men came together as boy band 3 Count and had just the right kind of heat with the crowd, as their awful singing and dancing routine went on for just a bit too long in the middle of the ring. I remember utterly detesting these segments as a teenage viewer. However, I couldn't wait to see the guys actually wrestle, as they were undeniably spectacular in the ring. Some of the greatest ever WCW Cruiserweight matches involved these three grappling the likes of the Young Dragons, and that's saying something considering WCW's previous pedigree at presenting high-flying action. Similarly, instead of canning WCW's copycat hardcore division when clearly WWE were doing the same job much better on the other side, Russo decided to keep the belt and help highlight an underutilised star instead. British-born Norman Smiley was always the curious character in WCW. He was a former CMLL World Heavyweight Champion, he was trained by the Malenkos in the mid-80s, and he thrived as a heel before touring Japan and briefly appearing in ECW. He was already a real wrestling journeyman by 1997 when he signed with WCW. Norman was always presented as a lower card comedy act and had some success as a cruiserweight, feuding with the likes of Chavo Guerrero and Prince Iaukea. When Russo arrived, he decided to shift gears and make Smiley the stalwart of the hardcore division as he won the belt from Brian Knobbs in November 1999. Here's where Russo's mind for the business cannot be discounted, as he gave an ingenious twist to Smiley's character. He was to be deathly scared of weapons, and so Screaming Norman Smiley was born, a reluctant hardcore icon. WCW had not pushed anyone new to the main event for years. Fresh talent was needed at the top, rather than relying on the past-it main eventers, as Bischoff had done since 1995. DDP, Scott Steiner and Booker T were ripe for a main event push. Two surefire babyfaces in Booker T and DDP, and a heel in Steiner, who was one of WCW's greatest prospects come the year 2000. Sure, DDP had ascended back in 1999, and while he fared better than many of the other WCW originals, he still had to play second fiddle to the likes of Hogan and Nash, despite being one of Bischoff's best pals backstage. One thing Bischoff and Russo could agree on was that DDP was a reliable, likeable, honest and hard-working guy, and Russo knew the fans would accept him in the main event, no problem at all. Booker T had been ready to ascend to the main event for years. WCW's glass ceiling in the 90s only allowed for so much progress, and Booker T spent literally years floundering around the TV and US titles and got precisely nowhere. I will admit that Booker almost got shafted by Russo's bad booking on multiple occasions, and I was incredulous when he joined the Misfits in Action and changed his name to G.I. Bro. Thank goodness that sense prevailed by mid-year, and he won the World Heavyweight Championship from Jeff Jarrett to become just the third African American to win a wrestling world title. Booker really brought some prestige and weight to the championship, although it was somewhat marred by him having to lose it to Russo in one of his terrible booking decisions. And on the final episode of Nitro, he would defeat Scott Steiner to win the title back and carry it into the WWE. Steiner is another case of too little too late. I've covered some of his WCW career in the video on your screen now, but I will reiterate that they really had something spectacular with Scott, and if only the trigger had been pulled sooner, he could have been a massive draw in a new WCW. A truly believable psychopath, Russo was right to identify that Steiner was a naturally brilliant heel, the likes of which the wrestling world had not seen for years. All of these positive ideas and decisions on behalf of Russo could have been the cornerstones of saving WCW from its demise. However, without a filter like Vince McMahon guiding him, his bad ideas outshone his good intentions in the end.
Are you ready?